first century, he was their leader. Vicar of Christ for 1 billion Catholics. But if his passing has stirred emotion around the world, it is because this Pope stepped far beyond theology. John Paul II transformed what it means to be pontiff. Not just a priest, a geopolitical leader. He was called God's politician. Never afraid to encounter dissension, Karol Wojtyła traveled the globe, using the power of his office as none before, standing up for human rights, fighting violence and repression, a politics of morality, a politics of controversy for the statesman Pope. Poland, 2002. An emotional homecoming for Pope John Paul II. He has visited nearly 2/3 of all the countries on earth. But this trip is different. A return to his homeland, the place it all began. For the gathering crowds, this man was much more than a priest. He changed their lives. He changed their world just 2.5 decades before. Poland, 1978. A country in chains. Behind the Iron Curtain, basic human freedoms had eroded. Dissent was beaten down in the streets.
Habemus Papam!
When Karol Wojtyła, Cardinal of Krakow, was named Pope, it gave a people a spark of hope.
Amazing thing had happened to them. Here are the Poles under the heel of communism, and yet one of their number becomes what to a devout nation is the most important man in the world. And he stands up and says, I am with you.
It became very clear that he would be a symbol for all those who stood against a totalitarian domination of people and against communism. Now, obviously some of the communist leaders didn't agree with him, but they knew he was a force to be reckoned with.
In June of 1979, John Paul II, the native son, returned home, and an entire nation showed up to greet him. 3 million people arrived at a single mass in the center of Krakow. Images banned from national TV show the extent of the crowd. And all the while, the Polish Secret Service was watching, as seen in these actual images from secret police files. The Polish government tried to minimize the crowds, but the CIA struck back.
And we actually developed a technical device, a broadcasting system that fit in a suitcase, and at one point overrode Polish national television and broadcast the itinerary for the Pope's trip. How much impact that had, we'll never know, but it's clear that the millions of Poles who turned out to see him on his first visit in particular, as well as on subsequent visits, had a huge political impact.
It would prove a triumphant tour for the new Pope. Over that week, an estimated 13 million people, 1/3 of the entire population of Poland, came out to see him. And to them, the Pope offered a message of support.
Ducha nie gaście. Musicie być mocni mocą wiary.
In a nation of believers, he reminded them what they had always believed, who they were as a people. Officially, it was spiritual, but the powers in Russia saw it clearly for what it was, a threat to communism. In a secret document, the Kremlin ordered Soviet agencies from the KGB to state television to work against the new Pope. 13 months after the Pope's trip, in August of 1980, a simple electrician named Lech Wałęsa led a strike in the Gdansk shipyard. Gathering around a rustic wooden cross, they built on the base the Pope had established.
For
2 decades, I could only find 10 people that wanted to fight from a nation of 40 million. Nobody, I repeat, nobody, believed that communism would end. And then this incredible thing happened. A Pole became Holy Father, the Pope. And within a year after his visit to Poland, in 1 year, it went from 10 people to a movement of 10 million.
Soon a movement was born. The Kremlin responded quickly, sending troops to the Polish border. A show of force that carried a threat not just to Poland, but the entire Eastern Bloc and the brittle peace of the Cold War. Unwilling to counter with military might, Washington turned to the Vatican. The CIA showed the Pope American spy pictures revealing the troop movement along the border.
We shared a lot of intelligence with the Vatican in terms of what was going on in Eastern Europe. We shared information about weapons developments in the Soviet Union, what we thought was happening in the Soviet Union.
John Paul declared that solidarity was an internal Polish affair and that the Soviets should not interfere. Some worried he was playing with fire. In the summer of 1981, Warsaw Pact troops held 3 weeks of military maneuvers, with the entire Eastern Bloc assembling armies on both sides of the Polish border. And the world slid closer to the brink of nuclear war. In Eastern Europe, the Cold War was heating up. But when the first shots were fired in May of 1981, it was on Vatican soil. The Pope was rushed to the hospital. With 2 bullets in the stomach, an inch from the vital organs. A professional assassin, Mehmet Ali Agca, was apprehended. According to Lech Wałęsa himself, the Pope had become too great a threat to the Eastern Bloc leaders. When asked if their fear triggered the assassination attempt, his response was clear.
Yes, not just fear, panic. The devil was trying to fight us, but I knew it could not end like this. I was convinced that the Holy Father was a gift from the heavens and that he would be saved.
There are a lot of crackpots around in the world, and maybe it was that, but I don't know that it was a plot by communists to knock off the Pope. I would be stupid if it was.
This much is certain. Although the Pope would recover, by the fall of 1981, political turmoil in Poland had boiled over into a full-scale crisis. Protesters were in the street, demanding an end to communist rule. And in December 1981, martial law was declared.
Rada Państwa w zgodzie z postanowieniami Konstytucji wprowadziła dziś o północy stan wojenny na obszarze całego kraju.
Once again, the troops ruled the streets. John Paul II responded immediately. Warning that Polish blood must not flow, he all but dared the Polish government to challenge him. When the Pope met with General Jaruzelski in Warsaw in 1983, John Paul had no armies with him. Yet it was the general, not the Pope, who was shaking, clearly in awe of the man he was meeting. A non-violent revolution was underway, and the fate of Poland hung in the balance. It wasn't the first time. 4 decades before, when the Nazis invaded, young Karol Wojtyła lived just 18 miles from Auschwitz. He witnessed childhood friends being carted off to the death camps. He joined the cultural resistance, entering the underground seminary. The fall of Nazism brought a new terror: Stalinist repression. Religion was outlawed, but Cardinal Wojtyła kept conducting clandestine masses. And the faithful kept coming, attracted by a quiet tenacity that would foreshadow a much larger victory. By 1987, the Soviets were losing their taste for confrontation. Slowly but surely, the party leadership was eroding.
Linia odnowy, porozumienia, reform jest w Polsce nieodwracalna. Miniony czas potwierdził to w pełni. Z tej drogi nie zejdziemy. Historii nie da się unieważnić.
General Jaruzelski, meeting the Pope, admitted, "We have lost. There is no future for the party." A triumphant third papal visit drove home the victory. And within 2 years, Solidarity leaders would be running the country. The fall of Poland would set the rest of the dominoes tumbling all across the Soviet bloc. And just months later, the Berlin Wall itself would come crashing down.
And I think the Holy Father, since his election, had placed a kind of a wire with a dynamite in that wall.
His moral authority was there as a strength to those of us who wanted to see the end of a communist East Germany and wanted to see the unification of Germany itself.
He helped ignite a process in Eastern Europe that eventually led to the unraveling of the entire Soviet Union 10 years later, an amazing only a decade later. And most of the people that I know who look at this believe that he played a fundamental role in that.
Just 3 weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Mikhail Gorbachev traveled to the Vatican to meet the Pope. From the start, Gorbachev was captivated by his fellow Slav.
When I first met him, he had arranged it in such a way that the two of us talked for 10 minutes in Russian. Now, I value that very much. I remember that meeting with pleasure. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. First, I want to say that his eyes, they sparkle, so to speak. He looks at you very attentively. I wouldn't say that he's a flashy orator, but he is a great master of dialogue.
Behind closed doors, they found a common bond.
Speaking about Europe, he said that Europe should breathe with 2 lungs. It's a very strong metaphor. It means that we need a united Europe.
At the end of the meeting, Gorbachev made a major announcement at the Vatican, personally guaranteeing freedom of religion and conscience in the USSR. It was another quiet victory, another bloodless revolution. Successfully dealing with hardline regimes would become a hallmark of John Paul II's role as statesman for the oppressed. In South America, he would find himself face to face with one of the bloodiest dictators of our time. A confrontation was coming. '87 found the Pope facing a nightmare. A country torn apart by violence and terror. A bloody coup had brought General Augusto Pinochet to power in Chile. After 14 years of military dictatorship, thousands were dead and missing as the right wing battled the left for supremacy.
Not the kind of place you'd expect a pope to have any influence, not a place you'd think he would want to visit. And yet, I suppose a way of setting the tone for what he was going to do, serving notice on dictators and repressive people that they would not escape his presence, his moral authority.
Chile was a country in crisis. Violent protests met by brutal police repression, disappearances, and murder. and even the church torn on the best way to proceed. Into the middle of this maelstrom, the Pope arrived at the presidential palace to meet the dictator Pinochet, trying to find a note of reconciliation and hope. But right from the beginning, political maneuvering was going on.
I think that Pinochet thought how he could get the best out of the papal visit to La Moneda Palace. And so he took advantage of the Pope when they took him by surprise to the balcony. We couldn't control the movement in the palace, so it was something absolutely surprising outside the program.
This was a shock for a lot of people in Chile, but also all over the world. I think it is still a dark page of the papacy of John Paul II, because Pinochet had really bled on his hands.
But what the world didn't see was John Paul working behind the scenes. In private conversation, even as Pinochet tried to support his dictatorship, the Pope stressed the importance of individual liberties and human rights. The next day, April 3rd, when the Pope took his message to the people, a long simmering conflict boiled over. John Paul had come to say Mass in Santiago. As the Mass began, demonstrators were protesting against Pinochet. But when the regime sent in the water cannons, a tense scene turned into a riot. Clouds of tear gas spread over the square. But the Pope kept on. John Paul's message would resonate over the next months. When the general wrote him asking for guidance, his answer was unequivocal.
Pinochet was wavering whether to resign or not. From the Vatican came the clear message, resign.
Within a year, dictator Augusto Pinochet had stepped down. Why did this Pope have such an impact? He had no weapons, no armies. His only political power was the power of the media. John Paul was the first Pope to grasp that most contemporary of tools, television. What this Pope understood is that in the world of politics, every trip is a kind of currency, an item for barter, a chance to make a change.
There isn't a politician alive who wouldn't like to have the opportunity to be standing on his home turf next to the Pope, getting a kind of implicit thumbs up. And so there is a kind of quid pro quo here. The deal is, I will stand next to you and allow the cameras to shoot rolls of film, allow these images to go out over TV. But behind closed doors, I'm going to make sure that you deliver on the kinds of reforms that I think your society needs.
That was exactly what happened when the Pope recently found himself back in Latin America with another legendary strongman, Fidel Castro. The real action happened behind the scenes. In exchange for his visit, the Pope won the release of more than 100 political prisoners, and Fidel's promise to allow televised masses across the country. Yet only a few weeks later, some reforms were rolled back. Some prisoners returned to jail. If the Pope consistently prided himself on standing up for the oppressed, his message did not always seem quite so clear in Latin America. Throughout the 80s, many Catholic priests were engaged in the so-called liberation theology, taking the side of the poor against totalitarian police states. In Nicaragua, Marxist Sandinistas had just defeated a brutally repressive regime after a 10-year battle. They saw their revolution and their new government as God's work.
I was raised in Catholicism, and I learned to view Christ as a spiritual and social fighter that the poor look to. I approach revolution through Christ.
The Pope had a different view. Never one to shy from controversy, he arrived in Managua in 1983, skeptical of the new Sandinista government. He believed religion and armed revolution didn't mix. Several priests, including Ernesto Cardinal, didn't see any contradiction. Cardinal had become the Sandinista Minister of Culture.
As the Pope approaches, Cardinal goes down on one knee, expecting to kiss the Pope's ring. Instead, the Pope pulls his hands away and gives him double-barreled finger-wagging gesture, saying, "First you must straighten out your situation with the Church." And Cardinal says, "Yes, Holy Father, I'll do it."
For some, the Pope's position seemed confusing, even hypocritical. Why was it okay to fight dictators in Eastern Europe, but not Latin America? For the Pope, the reason was simple. Growing up under communism, he saw Marxists not as liberators, but tyrants. He saw the people of Nicaragua as newly oppressed. But many here saw themselves as newly freed.
The Pope came here to destroy the revolution. They had told him that if he spoke out against the government before a majority Catholic population, the people would support the Pope against the revolution. The Pope made a mistake.
The two visions were poised to collide at an evening mass in Managua. In the crowd that night, the banners read, "There is no contradiction between Christianity and revolution."
Pueda legítimamente comprometer la identidad.
So when the Pope began to speak against the revolution in that way that he has, the people became increasingly impatient and discontented.
Silencio.
Silencio. And 3 times the Pope had to shout, "Silence." And that further annoyed the people, because this was a population that wasn't accustomed to being silenced by its leaders.
The Pope didn't expect a situation like that. It was a very tense moment. I remember a bishop, Monsignor Barney, came over and asked me to talk to the people, to calm them down. But it didn't seem prudent to me to take the microphone in the middle of the Mass.
In the end, neither side would be swayed. For one, revolution was a necessity. For the other, violence was never the answer.
In some ways, you can say that John Paul II and Daniel Ortega represented the two options for resistance to the police states in Latin America in the 1970s and 80s. One, a religious cultural option, the other, a political and military option. And in the end, of course, I think the Pope would feel that history has shown that he, and not Daniel Ortega, got it right.
On occasions, popes have been correct. On other occasions, not so correct. And even the Vatican itself has recognized this, has acknowledged those errors committed.
Right or wrong, soon enough, John Paul II would find himself in the middle of another crisis, the most unrelenting in the world. It is one of the most violent regions on Earth. A desert scarred by battles that have raged for centuries. Hatreds nursed across the years. The Middle East has thwarted the best efforts of the world's most experienced diplomats. But it would be here that the Pope would contribute some of his most powerful work. For this Pope brought a skill almost unique in today's geopolitical landscape. he knew how to listen.
You know that for him in this moment when speaking with him, you are a very important person. He is listening and listening very much.
Of the Pope's 9 titles, the one that fit him best was Pontifex Maximus, a builder of bridges. And that is what he intended to do in an often discussed and often postponed trip to the Middle East.
Ritiene possibile una santa alleanza fra cristiani, musulmani ed ebrei per curare I mali del mondo?
Dovrebbe essere. Io penso che questa alleanza si deve cercare in tutte le dimensioni. Lei vede che da tanto tempo I papi scrivono le loro encicliche indirizzandosi non solamente ai cattolici, cristiani, ma anche tutti gli uomini di buona volontà.
The Pope's trip to the Holy Land had several agendas, one of which, of course, was reconciliation of the 3 great monotheistic religions. I think he was also atoning for the sins of the past, if you will, of the Catholic Church. There's a lot of dissent over whether or not previous popes could have done more to save Jews, to stop Nazism, or at least to slow down its progress. And so he needed to reach out at that time to do that.
The Pope sensed that humility was the way to build bridges, to apologize for the mistakes of the past. But many in the Curia were opposed. They didn't want the Pope to ask anyone's forgiveness. A conflict inside the Vatican was brewing.
Theologically, it's problematic to them to imagine that the church, as an institution, could ever sin. The church is supposed to be the spotless bride of Christ.
They said, if we begin to admit that we have done this and this and this, then we say the same which the propaganda, the anti-church propaganda, has said so many years against the church.
The debate over Israel and the Jews was one of the most volatile that the Catholic Church had ever encountered. But this Pope was not just tenacious. He was stubborn. And he believed the trip to Israel was crucial, especially because of his own background.
He had Jewish friends who were dragged off to the ovens. He understood what had happened to the Jews. His country suffered in an enormous way under the Holocaust, and he needed to reach out and to reconcile and to make peace, if you will, with the past.
John Paul had broken ground in 1986 as the first pope ever to pray in a synagogue. In 2000, he set off for Israel.
Go home now.
But when he arrived, he was confronting some powerful emotions. Eli Zborowski is a Polish Jew who lost his entire family in the Holocaust. Although he was saved from the death camps by Polish Catholics, for him, as for many Jews, the perceived failure of the Vatican to speak out against the Nazis left the Church with much to answer for. But this Pope came to the Holocaust Memorial, Yad Vashem, to speak out for those who had come before.
And when I was called from Jerusalem that I should be one of the 6 people who were in hiding to come and greet the Pope, I said, I have no reason to go. At that time, the Pope was to me the Church. It was the continuation of the Pope from during the war times and before the war, and for all the ages, for all the centuries. This is the Pope. So at that, I had no interest to go. Then the chairman of Yad Vashem said, Eli, yes, you have to understand, the Pope wants to say something. What does he want to say? Must be an apology. What else can he want to say in Yad Vashem? I decided to go. The 6 people were standing in line in the Hall of Remembrance. And the Pope walked over to the 6 people. And I, the first one, greeted the Pope. And I just greeted him in Polish. And I want to say, Your Holiness, that I was hidden by a Christian family. In fact, I was hidden by two families. I was in one place 18 months, in another place. He asked me where, and I told him where. He knew exactly where this place is. His eyes, his looks around, his willingness to see everything. For him, I was a human being. I was someone that he did care. He expressed a wish, if there are any Jews that survived from his hometown, he would like to meet with them. He asked for names, the landlord of the house where his father lived in. He asked by the name what happened to this family. He asked about Fischl the baker. He said it was every morning we had fresh rolls from the baker. Does someone live from this family? He is a human being. And to have such a person as a pope, as a leader of a country or of a religion, of millions of people, we are still lucky.
His tears at Yad Vashem would touch many, but another gesture would move a nation. A simple moment at the Wailing Wall, Judaism's holiest site for pilgrimage and devotion. It was just a simple prayer, a prayer for forgiveness, a hand reaching out. And though it trembled with age and illness, it carried a message of reconciliation, an enduring symbol, perhaps the greatest of his papacy. Of course, the tensions between faiths would not disappear overnight. But Pope John Paul was working on another front as well, reaching out to Muslims.
When the Pope wanted to reach out to Muslims, he went to Damascus, to the great Umayyad Mosque, the first Pope ever to enter a mosque like that, and to pray there.
And though bent with age and the ravages of Parkinson's disease, John Paul removed his shoes and became the first Pope ever to set foot in a mosque.
And he went into a mosque where there's a great sarcophagus, if you will, a glass case, which allegedly contains the head of John the Baptist, St. John the Baptist, inside a mosque. Just outside the courtyard is the tomb of Saladin, the Arab who liberated Jerusalem from the hands of the Crusaders. You couldn't pick a more symbolic place to go. He's really good at symbolism.
Yet for all the symbols and important first steps, a lasting peace remains elusive.
I hope and I pray that my visit will bring some comfort in your difficult situation.
John Paul, like every other leader of the 20th century, has failed in an attempt to bring peace to the Middle East. That needs to be said. At the same time, I think he has helped create conditions in which peace may be possible.
In all, he left the Middle East as he found it, a tough situation. But for this Pope, equally tough battles loomed elsewhere. The most challenging was playing out in a place the West had all but forgotten, an entire continent on the edge. Africa, a timeless land where the joy of a people has too often been betrayed by corrupt leaders. For many in the West, Africa was a continent that had simply fallen off the map. But not for John Paul II.
Almeno ci vorrebbe un po' di programmi, ci vorrebbe un po' di attenzioni, un po' di rispetto per questa parte che è sottosviluppata. Non basta notare questo. Bisogna vedere la sfida di tipo morale.
The Pope picks our concerns and speaks about it from the depth of his heart with clear conviction and honesty, saying that Africa deserves more than this.
This Pope said that the future of the Catholic Church lies in Africa. And numerically, he was certainly right.
the fastest growing religion in sub-Saharan Africa is indeed Christianity. He can see that here are people who are going to be part of church life indefinitely. Churches bursting at the seams.
With the numbers of Catholics doubling from 50 to 100 million, and even more potential converts.
Each of you has received from the Lord the call to be a priest.
It's no wonder the Pope began appointing so many local priests so quickly. 17 cardinals, 116 bishops. Then, too, the Pope was willing to grant these local leaders a freedom accorded almost nowhere else in the world. It was called enculturation. And it means mixing traditional Catholic ceremony with local culture.
The body of Christ. The body of Christ.
I think it's because the Pope realized very early on that in order to bring indigenous people's cultures towards the church, you had to respect their cultures, you had to respect their traditions, and that those traditions were not necessarily antagonistic to the church.
But if Africa has been a land of opportunity for the church, it is not uncontested. In some ways, it is a battlefield. For the perception in the Vatican has been that here in Africa the church is under attack by both Islam and communism. Today, more than 40 African nations are torn apart by civil war. Ancient conflicts between desert nomads and African tribes are played out in splits between Muslims and Christians in countries like Nigeria.
We are 50-50. 50% Christians, 50% Muslims, which is why we have a problem. There's no country in the world where you have as many Muslims and as many Christians living together in the same country.
In 1998, the Pope came with a message of peace for this teeming nation of 120 million. He joined Archbishop Onayakin to lead a mass. The Pope also reached out to Muslim leaders. But the visit did little to promote the reconciliation John Paul spoke of. Just 2 years after his visit, more than 100 churches were destroyed when rioting broke out between Muslims and Christians.
I love what the Pope says, that it is blasphemy to kill in the name of God. There can be no greater insult to God than to kill, saying it is religion. The moment you are killing people, you are no longer talking of religion, you are simply insulting God.
But the Pope had a powerful weapon in this battle, an intelligence network that's unparalleled worldwide.
The church is virtually everywhere in the world. They have embassies in 174 countries, but they have more than that. You'd think in conventional terms of having consulates in other major cities and countries, but they have people in virtually every city and village through the form of priests and nuns and missionaries and congregations. So they know at any given time what's going on in virtually every country, right down at the grassroots level where it's really important.
The information that came in through this network gave the Pope some unique opportunities for diplomacy, even if that diplomacy sometimes had to be carried out quietly in unusual ways. That's what happened in Mozambique. In this Catholic Portuguese colony, a 1975 Marxist takeover had triggered a civil war that raged for more than a decade.
Guerrillas used to call the Mozambican government just killers. And the Mozambican government used to call the guerrillas just bandits. We started to think that we had to arrange a first meeting.
In an old church in Rome, the community of Sant'Egidio was working behind the scenes. Functioning as an unofficial diplomatic arm of the Vatican, this Catholic organization convinced President Samora Machel to meet the Pope. And surprisingly enough, the communist and the Pope hit it off. Soon after, the Pope traveled to Mozambique. Sant'Egidio had also been traveling deep into the bush to work with the Renamo guerrillas. After 2 years, they convinced both sides to meet. The Vatican kept its distance, but behind the scenes, John Paul was consistently encouraging.
It is very helpful to have something like Sant'Egidio because they can float trial balloons. They can try things out in a way that if it goes bad, the Vatican cannot be blamed. It will be the community of Sant'Egidio that will carry the responsibility.
With so much at stake in this first meeting, even lunch was a diplomatic challenge.
We had to prepare the menu. We decided to cook 2 fishes because the head in Africa has the right to the head of the fish. And so giving them 2 fishes instead of 1 big fish, they felt that we were real mediators and that we were not for one side or for the other side. And so at the end of that meeting, they agreed to start officially a peace negotiation.
On October 4th, 1992, the 2 sides finally came together in Rome to sign a peace treaty. It was a triumph of unofficial diplomacy, a victory for Sant'Egidio and for Pope John Paul II.
We never stopped informing somehow the Holy Father. He said Sant'Egidio is charity without borders, and it is the capability of creating bridges. It is a son of his pontificate.
The Pope came to Sant'Egidio with a plaque to celebrate the end of war. Today, Africa remains a land of hope and desperation, a staging ground for battles still to come, the wars that are just heating up. Iraq, 2003. As an American-led coalition prepared to invade Iraq, the Pope once again demonstrated a willingness to take a controversial political stance. Gathering his bishops together, he launched an all-out diplomatic offensive to stop the coming invasion. For while America's leadership considered it a just war, John Paul did not. In St. Peter's Square, he preached against warfare, any kind of warfare, as a solution to problems.
Ho anche il dovere di ricordare a tutti questi giovani, più giovani, che non hanno questa esperienza, di ricordare e di dire mai più la guerra.
We differed with the Holy Father on, say, Desert Storm. But we understood his position. He just stands against war.
A shuttle of envoys traveled through the Vatican, and the Pope dispatched Cardinal Roger Echegaray, his senior advisor, to Iraq on February 11th, 2003, to meet with Saddam Hussein.
So I merely said, if you, Saddam Hussein, desire happiness and prosperity for your country, for mercy's sake, do not give the other party any reasons or pretexts for making war.
Good morning, Your Holiness.
In a last-ditch effort, the Pope held talks with Iraqi Vice President Tariq Aziz. But the aftermath seemed preordained. A stunningly short war. And while the world rejoiced at the deposing of a tyrant, it is clear the situation in Iraq will take years to be resolved. Meanwhile, the Pope himself was nominated for the 2003 Nobel Peace Prize for building a bridge between the West and the Muslim world, for refusing to back away from a deeply felt moral stance that all war is wrong. And while it's a position that was infuriatingly simplistic to some, there was a certain stubborn nobility to it. After more than 25 years as Pope, John Paul II left a powerful legacy. He set the stage for those who followed. the papal succession. For he appointed 122 of the 126 cardinals who elected his successor. And with 50% of those cardinals now from non-Western nations, he left behind a radically different kind of church. And so, after all the decades, John Paul II returned once more to his homeland. Back to the place it all started, the Curia in Krakow. The very same rooms he inhabited as a young Archbishop Wojtyła. And the same Poles who cheered him on 20 years ago were back. And this time they brought their children to see the man who changed their lives. Here, so many years later, he left them a very different church, a very different world from the one he inherited. And a message that went far beyond religion, a message of humanity. For God's politician, that message is still rippling outwards, far beyond the walls of the Vatican.